On July 8th, Naxos released on their American Classic series of CDs a recording called Balance of Power, orchestral music of Peter Boyer. For those listeners who are unfamiliar with Peter Boyer, he is currently one of the most sought after and in demand composers, arrangers, and conductors in the world today. His music has been performed by more than 200 orchestras throughout the world, often with Boyer himself conducting the ensemble. He has written for film and done orchestrations for some of the most well-known film composers around. He has received commissions from the Kennedy Center for Performing Arts, the Boston Pops Orchestra, the United States Marine Band, to name just a few. He received a Grammy nomination for his piece Ellis Island, The Dream of America, and worked as a composer in residence for the Fort Worth Symphony Orchestra. And I could go on and on. Quite simply, Peter Boyer has distinguished himself as one of the foremost American composers of his generation. And it is with great pleasure that I welcome to our virtual Classic 107 studios here over Zoom, Peter Boyer. Hi, Peter. Nice to
Hello,
meet you
Chris.
here.
Nice to see you as well. Thank you for such a very kind and generous introduction. Much appreciated.
Before we talk about the CD, one of the things that popped to my head when I was preparing for the interview was you did your master's and doctoral degrees in Hartford
Yes.
before traveling to California to study film score writing at USC. How are the two programs different? Was Hartford more sort of the technical side of composition, harmony, form, etc., and USC sort of more about the art of writing for film? What was the difference between the two programs?
Yeah, and of course we're going back a number of years. So I did an MM, a Master of Music, and then a DMA, a Doctor of Musical Arts, at the Hart School, which was called at the time the Hart School of Music, and now is just called the Hart School because it's also music and theater and dance, at University of Hartford. And then just did one additional year at USC, which is now called the USC Thornton School of Music. So the MM and the DMA degrees were, I guess, what one would refer to as traditional, classically oriented graduate degrees. And so one is really dealing with concert music and studying, what composers have studied for generations, a much more kind of traditional approach. Although I did have wonderful teachers and a younger set of teachers for the most part. So there was a kind of openness to style, which I really appreciated. And then the 1 year that I did following that, at USC was actually a non-degree program, as a graduate certificate. So I was a very unusual person. I may be the only person who's ever done this, I'm not sure. Certainly I was at the time, who actually had completed a doctoral degree and then done this one additional year, because most people generally did it right after college. So that was focused specifically and totally on film music, television music, which now we generally call media scoring. So interestingly, as my career has unfolded, the work that I've done in film and television has largely been supportive work for other composers as an orchestrator. And particularly in the last few years, concert music has become really the full-time thing that I've been doing quite a lot. So I would say that both of those experiences in graduate school, one of 4 years and one of just 1 year, they both helped prepare me for a career in different ways.
Mm-hmm. And so you mentioned concert music, and when I listen to your music, it's very cinematic in scope. When you compose, are you thinking about specific images when you're composing that inspire you? Like, can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And it's interesting that you say that because especially now that the new album has been released, and so there's a fair amount of attention that happens when an album is released, of course. And that phrase, cinematic concert music, seems to get applied to my music fairly often, which is certainly a perfectly fine thing, and I suppose is quite a legitimate way to describe it, because the music is very much influenced by both a great body of concert music repertoire and a great body of film music repertoire, and in some cases by the same people. So really, the answer to your question has to do with the specific commissions that I have, and I always try to honor the circumstances of the particular commission as well as I can. And interestingly, I've had a number of commissions that have kind of flowed from the success of my piece Ellis Island, The Dream of America. So there have been a number of, if you will, American themed works. And those suggest a certain kind of approach. And for example, this piece Fanfare for Tomorrow, which is on this album with the LSO, was
Mhm.
a short piece. It's the shortest work on the album. It's just under 3 minutes. So it's quite brief, but it was commissioned for the inauguration of President Joe Biden. And so that obviously suggests a certain kind of approach. And even though it might not necessarily evoke particular images, it is a particular kind of a style. And other works, for example, In the Cause of the Free, which is a Veterans Day themed piece, evokes in some sense the battlefield, military service, etc. So this is part of the challenge, is to evoke something in sound without necessarily having it be composed specifically to accompany images, because none of this music was actually composed to accompany images, and yet it might evoke images for a lot of listeners.
Yeah, I mean, for myself, I'm a fan of history. It's a pet passion of mine, and in particular American history. I always find American history so interesting. And I'm looking at your output, and there are so many pieces that are inspired by history, like the Kissinger piece on this latest disc, the Ellis Island CD, the Veterans Day Commission that you did. Has it just worked out that way, or are you a fan of American history as well?
Well, the answer is both. I am indeed, like you, it's interesting to hear you say that. I am a big fan or a buff of history. I'm somebody who's very interested in history, and the intersection between history and music has always interested me. And when I first started composing orchestral music, I also was, and still am, but particularly back then, were focused on mythology. And the idea of history and mythology and the way they intersect is very interesting to me. And one of the things that drew me to Ellis Island, which has become by far my best known and most performed piece, was a sense of kind of American mythology, that even though it's not that long ago, Americans often think of themselves, as a land built by immigrants, which has always been a controversial and yet a very important part of our history. And so that concept of how can I explore this musically was extremely interesting to me. So, and you say, did it kind of work out that way? I never really imagined, like if you had asked me, 12 years ago, would I write just a series of pieces that dealt with American history? And I would not necessarily have said that. But what happens, I think, is that a piece becomes successful, in this case, Ellis Island, and known. And then I think when commissioning opportunities arise and orchestras and people who run orchestras think, who could we get to do this particular thing that we have in mind? Somehow I seem to have found myself on a list on a number of occasions. So then I've been asked to do, pieces about, for example, political figures that I absolutely would not have imagined. And you mentioned, the Kissinger themed piece, Balance of Power. Balance
Right.
of Power was a completely unexpected commission, totally unexpected. And I only accepted it with certain misgivings and reservations. But ultimately, I said, this is important, and I have to try. And so that was a big part of this recording.
Which leads me to my next question. I always for me, the centerpiece on the disc is the work Balance of Power, this wonderful 3 movement orchestral work inspired by Henry Kissinger. And he's sort of he's an interesting character. I mean, he's still around. He's 99 years old and so associated with the Nixon administration. My understanding is you met Kissinger, and can you talk about that and how the piece grew out of that meeting with Kissinger?
Yes, it's an unusual story, to say the least. So I'll try to do the short version, because it's a kind of elaborate story. But the way that this project began was through an email. And in the fall of 2018, I received a completely unexpected email out of the blue from a woman named Bonnie McElveen Hunter, who is a former United States ambassador to Finland. And I knew her name because she is what we might call a patroness of American orchestral music. She's commissioned a number of terrific American composers. And so I knew her name, was quite surprised to hear from her. And the subject line of the email that I received was exactly this, quote, "Symphonic work dash Dr. Henry Kissinger," unquote. So this is a very attention-grabbing subject line. And I immediately, of course, was intrigued and also, daunted, because, Kissinger is a controversial figure. And as you say, he's the last surviving member of Nixon's cabinet, not exactly an administration that one seeks to celebrate in music, frankly. But a very important figure, and I only knew a relatively small amount about him. So I then engaged in a dialogue with Ambassador McElveen Hunter, Bonnie, and I was on the fence, and I didn't say yes right away. And she's persuasive, and she said, "Well, Peter, you're considering it, so you must come to New York, and I'll bring you to New York, and you have to have lunch with Dr. and Mrs. Kissinger." And so that did, in fact, take place. And I thought, well, I can't possibly turn down an opportunity to have lunch with Henry Kissinger. How many composers get such an opportunity? And it was fascinating. And as you say, now I mean, this was in January of 2019, so it's more than 3 years ago. So he was 96 at the time. And in any case, in the course of this lunch, which I found rather surreal, I must say, it became clear that this project was going to unfold, and I did have an opportunity to converse with him and to ask him. I thought I should ask this man, if I'm going to write this piece for the Kennedy Center and the National Symphony Orchestra, is there anything he might like in this piece? And there were only two specific things that he said, and I won't attempt to imitate his very famous low grovelly voice, but many people that voice. And so the first one was, quote, "Please don't make it too abstract so I can understand it," underquote. And so I thought, well, that's not really a problem because my music is not particularly abstract. It's pretty direct and understandable. But the second one was more memorable. And he said, quote, "Could it be a humorous symphony," unquote, and in that low, distinctive voice. And I thought, well, that's a surprising request. But I realized that he really had been renowned for his wit, and this was his request. And so I thought, well, first of all, it's not exactly a symphony, but it's close. It's a 3-movement symphonic work. So anyway, as I then spent months reading about this and figuring out how to approach it, this phrase "balance of power" kept coming up in the readings that I did of his writings and also writings about him. And I thought, well, that's a great title for a piece. That gives me some sense of it. So I ended up settling on a 3-movement structure for the piece. The first movement is called "A Sense of History." The second movement is called "A Sense of Humor," subtitled "Scherzo Politico." And the third movement is titled "A Sense of Direction." And so the first movement is really quite heavy, and really it has a darkness and a weightiness to it. And I wanted to try to suggest struggle and conflict and war and some of this great canvas of history that I really felt from reading his writings, especially his book Diplomacy, which was fascinating to read. So that's what the first movement is about. But the second movement was my attempt to honor this request. And so I thought, well, if he wants humor, I'm going to write a scherzo, and I'm going to write, kind of amusing scherzo. And I thought, well, how can I personalize this in some way? And so I hit upon the idea of a duet for contrabassoon and bass clarinet, which are two instruments, especially that don't usually
it's a wonderful moment in that second movement. I broke out laughing. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. So this was my, my tribute, if you will, to this famously low, grovelly voice of his. And then the contrabassoon and bass clarinet engage in a little dialogue where they're playing blues scales at each other. And I think of this as a kind of negotiation. He was known for negotiations. So that's kind of the middle of the middle movement. It's like the center of the whole 3-movement work. And then in the third movement, I really wanted to be able to do something optimistic. I thought I needed to, and I wanted to. But frankly, if one reads Kissinger's writings, one does not feel especially optimistic. It's pretty heavy stuff. But I found this phrase, "a sense of direction," and it recurred a number of times, and he was using it to praise certain leaders that he felt throughout history possessed this. So I thought, okay, this is my excuse. I can use this phrase, "a sense of direction," and I can do something optimistic and do the kind of music I think for which I'm known to a certain extent, and try to balance the heaviness of the first movement with that. So, it's more easily said than done. And in fact, between the reading, the researching, and the composing and the orchestrating, it was about 9 months of work to write this 18, 19-minute piece. So hopefully it's turned out well enough to fit the bill.
Yeah, it's a great piece. One of the things I realized when I was preparing for the interview is that you've really developed a relationship with the President's Own United States Marine Band, which is quite possibly one of the finest wind ensembles in the world. It is a premier ensemble. Can you talk? There's two pieces that are associated with the ensemble: the Fanfare Hymn and Finale, which you wrote for them, I believe, for their 220th anniversary. Yes. But then there's also that piece, Fanfare for Tomorrow, that you were talking about earlier, that was performed at the inauguration of President Biden. Can you talk about those two pieces? And yes. what was it like to have a piece performed at such a prestigious event, such as a presidential inauguration?
Yeah, good questions. And in this case, a very unusual way in which this piece was premiered because of the specific circumstances of the inauguration. So yes, indeed, the album contains three pieces, of which these are two, which started life as concert band works. And if you had asked me 5 years ago whether that would be the case with any of my future music, I would not have thought so. But the idea of writing for concert band is something that never particularly struck me because it wasn't the world that I'd come from. But I ended up writing a piece called Curtain Raiser for concert band in 2017. And then I thought, okay, I've written a concert band piece. Good. I've checked that off my list. I'm done with concert band music. Back to the orchestra. And then I heard in the fall of 2017, I heard from Colonel Jason Fettig, who was the director of the United States Marine Band. And he asked for a piece for their 220th anniversary. And I knew from the little research that I'd done for the first wind band piece that John Williams had written the 215th anniversary piece called For the President's Own, and that they only did an anniversary piece every 5 years. So I thought, well, I have to say yes to this. So I guess I'm going to write another concert band piece. And, as you say, they're an extraordinary ensemble, really quite remarkable. And for me, it's a kind of mental shift because I have become so accustomed to the orchestra. I've been so accustomed to having a body of strings to work with. And then when one doesn't have strings, then, it's an interesting, a different kind of approach. But it was a wonderful experience. And they performed this in the summer of 2018, and they took it on tour. This is Fanfare, Hymn, and Finale. And so I made a mental note to myself that at some point I needed to make an orchestral version of this music. So indeed, it worked out that I was given the opportunity to do a piece for President Biden's inauguration. And because of the very unusual circumstances between the pandemic and, shall we say, the sort of chaotic situation in Washington, what normally would have been, I think, a 2-month lead time at least, was in fact a very, very short lead time. And so I received the invitation on January 1st of 2021 to write a piece for the inauguration, which of course was then 19 days from then. But I was told that I needed to have it done in about 10 days. So that's one of the reasons it's a short piece. But I had written a 1-minute piece for solo horn called Fanfare for Tomorrow, the original version of the piece, as part of the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra's pandemic project, their fanfare project, where they commissioned many American composers to write brief pieces for single instruments because everybody was in lockdown at home. So I had written this 1-minute solo horn piece, and I thought this really has the potential to be expanded into something else. And so when Colonel Jason Fettig asked me about this commission, I said, here's what I think I should do. I should take this piece and I should expand it for the United States Marine Band. And I sent it to him, and he immediately said, yes, the right idea, the right theme, the right title. Please do, and please have it in 10 days. So yeah, it was an extraordinary experience and very energizing. And then, of course, surreal in many ways, because I was sitting here at my desk in my studio orchestrating this piece when the events of January 6th occurred, and just trying to grapple with all of that, all of the chaos and all of the uncertainty. And yet still I was writing and was orchestrating this very optimistic piece. And I thought, well, I'm going with optimism. It's an optimistic title. It's an optimistic piece of music. And it was an incredible moment. I mean, when the premiere happened, it happened exactly at the moment at which President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris arrived at the Capitol in their limos for the inauguration. And at that moment, the United States Marine Band was playing my piece. So I heard it in the background on television coverage as they're open. And there's this crazy moment where there's a modulation in my piece that goes up a step. And that was precisely the moment when they opened the door to President Biden's limo for him to come out. And the modulation occurred. And people were sending me notes like, how did you plan that? It's a perfect modulation. So it was a very interesting moment. I would have enjoyed the opportunity to be there in person, but instead I heard it in this interesting way. And then, of course, I made a new version for the album for orchestra, and got the chance to record it with the London Symphony, which was very exciting.
And for our Classic 107 listeners, both of those pieces are on this amazing disc, Balance of Power. Okay, so you get to conduct the London Symphony Orchestra. What's it like conducting your own music with a Ferrari orchestra like that?
It is a truly fantastic experience, I have to say. this is my fourth album, and the second one with the London Symphony Orchestra, and also my second and third albums were with the Philharmonia and with the London Philharmonic. So the way that my career has unfolded is every number of years I've been able to work it out to go to London and to make these recordings, and so they represent milestones for me personally, but also they represent the culmination of months or even years of work, and all of that has to unfold by definition in a very short span of time. So there's a huge amount of preparation involved. And because I am a conductor, although I'm fortunate to have many conductors conduct my music and many good ones, there is something completely thrilling about actually standing on the podium oneself. So in a sense, I have to take my composer hat off and put my conductor hat on. And then really, I've tried to describe this before, and it's difficult to describe. It's like contradictory things are going on at the moment, because I'm standing on the podium, starting a piece. Even the very first read with an orchestra like the London Symphony Orchestra is stunning. It's completely overwhelming. So on the one hand, I'm trying to be very professional and disciplined and listen carefully and make adjustments that need to be made and do what a session conductor has to do. But the composer in me is just going, this is like the greatest Christmas morning you ever had when you were a kid. I mean, this is so fantastic. So yeah, it's a wonderful experience, and this entire album, an hour of music, was recorded in 3 sessions over 2 days. So that tells you something about, and of course they'd never played any of it before. So the ability of an orchestra like that to be able to do it so quickly, and then very quickly make any adjustments and go through, sections of music and get just stunningly good performances is very exciting.
And one of the things that really struck me on the disc was there's this trumpet solo in this piece,
Yes.
in the cause of the free, that you wrote for Veterans Day. It's unbelievable. I mean, and so what? Just one take?
It is unbelievable, and the player is a young player who is just their recent principal trumpet, just appointed within the last year. His name is James Fountain, and I mean, it was a very emotional moment for me, because it's an emotional piece. I had never had the opportunity to conduct it before. This is the second recording, because it was a recording made with Cincinnati and Robert Sullivan, the principal trumpet of Cincinnati Symphony and Pops. So I'd experienced the piece at a very high level for sure. But standing on the podium myself, and just the first, I mean, James Fountain had received the part ahead of time. We talked about it a little bit, but to simply be in the room and then to hear it, there's an energy to it that is very hard to describe. And it was, it's a 1-minute unaccompanied solo. So it's complete silence from all of his colleagues, and he's just playing this solo. And I'm just standing there absorbing it and listening to it. And then there's a little coda in which the strings and the chimes and percussion come in at the end and put an ending to this. And when I then cut it off, I just literally started to cry, because it was so beautiful and it was so appropriate. And it was a kind of very special culminating moment as a composer and as a conductor. And I needed a minute to just collect myself and pull myself together. So we did do 2 more takes. But I mean, it was pretty stunning in one take. So yeah, my hat is off to James Fountain, and all of his colleagues. You could see, in an orchestra that's that good, when somebody does something that's at that level, there's a respect that they get from their colleagues that is very perceptible. And I wanted to really enjoy that moment. So I'm so glad that we captured that for this recording, because I think it's very special.
Absolutely. Peter, we're out of time. We're actually over time. Sorry.
Okay.
I'm gonna wrap the conversation up this way. I know Leonard Bernstein is a big influence on you and your music. It sort of begs the question. I know your first symphony is actually dedicated to Bernstein. Begs the question, what do you think of Bradley Cooper playing Bernstein in this upcoming film Maestro that's coming out next year?
I look forward to seeing that very much, and I'm pretty good friends with Jamie Bernstein, with Leonard Bernstein's oldest child, elder daughter, and she actually did an online seminar for a few weeks called the Lenny Lens, and then she played a little Zoom excerpt of her chatting with Bradley Cooper, talking about the role, and it definitely generated a lot of excitement for me. So I think all of us who are Bernstein lovers are looking forward to this very much.
It's going to be an interesting movie, that's for sure.
Yeah, I think so.
Peter, the CD, The Balance of Power, is so good. It is now fully in rotation here at Classic 107. Thanks for taking the time to chat with me today. And please keep in touch when you have new stuff coming out.
Absolutely.
Thanks for chatting with me.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for all the kind words and good questions. And I look forward to coming back.
Thank you.